On the morning of May 24, 1941, in the grey, ice-choked waters of the Denmark Strait, the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen found herself at the head of one of the most dangerous naval sorties of the Second World War. She was a cruiser in a column that also contained the most powerful battleship Germany had ever built, and yet within hours she would be the one the Royal Navy could not catch, could not sink, and could not forget. The admirals who had planned Operation Rheinübung expected Bismarck to dominate the headlines. They were right, but not in the way any of them intended. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, it was Prinz Eugen who kept surviving. This is her story. To understand why Prinz Eugen's existence became so remarkable, you have to understand the purpose she was built to serve, and the company she was expected to keep. By the spring of 1941, Germany's surface fleet strategy rested on a simple and ruthless logic: starve Britain into submission. Grand Admiral Raeder had convinced the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht that severing Britain's Atlantic supply lines would decide the war. Operation Rheinübung, Exercise Rhine, was his instrument. The plan called for Bismarck and Prinz Eugen to break through the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland and fall upon the convoys crossing from North America. 7 tankers and 2 supply ships had already been pre-positioned across the operational area, stretching as far west as Labrador and as far south as the Cape Verde Islands, to sustain the raiders at sea. On paper, the force looked formidable. Bismarck displaced around 50,000 tons fully laden and carried 8 38-centimeter guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 800 kilograms. She had been designed specifically to outgun every treaty-compliant capital ship the Royal Navy possessed. Prinz Eugen herself was no lightweight, an Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruiser displacing over 18,000 tons at full load, armed with 8 20.3-centimeter guns, and capable of better than 32 knots. On paper, the two ships together represented a combination of speed, firepower, and endurance that no single British force in the Atlantic could comfortably match. And yet the operation was compromised before it began. Raeder's original scheme had called for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau to join the sortie. Scharnhorst needed engine repairs and would not be ready until early July. Gneisenau had been struck by a torpedo from a British aircraft while at Brest and was out of action for 6 months. Admiral Lütjens, who commanded the force at sea, had pleaded for further delay, either until Scharnhorst was repaired, or until Bismarck's sister ship Tirpitz could join them. The crew of Tirpitz was not yet fully trained. Raeder refused both requests and ordered the operation to proceed. His reasoning was partly strategic and partly institutional. With Operation Barbarossa imminent, the Kriegsmarine would be reduced to a supporting role in the east, and Raeder wanted a decisive surface success on record before that moment arrived. Lütjens sailed under protest, with a force half the size he had wanted. Prinz Eugen sailed from Godenhafen, the port the Poles know as Gdynia, at approximately 2100 hours on May 18, 1941. Bismarck followed at 2 o'clock on the 19th. The two ships rendezvoused off Cape Arcona on Rügen Island and were joined by the destroyers Z-23 and Friedrich Eckold. They pressed north through the Kattegat on May 20th, and within hours the Swedish aircraft-carrying cruiser Gotland spotted them in the normal shipping lanes and filed a routine report. That report found its way to the British naval attaché in Stockholm and was forwarded to the Admiralty. British reconnaissance aircraft confirmed the German presence in the fjords near Bergen, where Prinz Eugen was topped off with fuel on May 21st, before both ships made their break for the Atlantic on the 22nd. The British response was swift and overwhelming. Vice Admiral Holland, in the battlecruiser Hood, sortied with the newly commissioned battleship Prince of Wales and 6 destroyers to intercept in the Denmark Strait. The heavy cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk were already on patrol in those waters. Suffolk, equipped with radar, was able to shadow the Germans through the night of May 23 while remaining outside German gun range. Holland's plan was to close rapidly from the west, approaching in darkness so that the German ships would be silhouetted against the afterglow of a sun that in those latitudes would not set until 1:51, while his own force came in unseen. It was a sound plan. It was also about to unravel. What happened next elevated Prinz Eugen from participant to protagonist. Hood opened fire at 5:52 on the morning of May 24, at a range of approximately 26,500 yards. Holland had ordered fire to be directed at the leading ship, but the leading ship was no longer Bismarck. The concussion of Bismarck's guns during a brief exchange with Norfolk on the evening of the 23rd had knocked out Bismarck's own forward radar, and Lütjens had repositioned Prinz Eugen ahead of Bismarck as a consequence. Holland, a gunnery expert of long experience, mistook the cruiser for the battleship and opened fire on her. Hood's guns were pointed at the wrong target. Prince of Wales, to her credit, had correctly identified Bismarck from the outset and engaged her immediately. Prinz Eugen, meanwhile, returned fire on Hood and scored an early hit that started a rapidly spreading fire amidships. Then, at approximately 6 o'clock, one or more shells from Bismarck, 38-centimeter rounds, struck Hood near her aft magazines. The great battlecruiser, 48,000 tons and the pride of the Royal Navy for 2 decades, broke apart and sank within 3 minutes. Of her crew of 1,418, only 3 survived. Vice Admiral Holland was not among them. Prince of Wales continued the action but was suffering simultaneous mechanical failures in her new quadruple gun turrets. She had sailed with shipyard workers still aboard, and had taken multiple hits from both Bismarck's 38-centimeter shells and Prinz Eugen's 20.3-centimeter rounds. Her commanding officer, Captain Leach, was wounded when a shell struck the bridge. He broke off the engagement under a smokescreen. The battle had lasted less than 10 minutes from Hood's first salvo to her destruction. Prinz Eugen had fought through it and emerged undamaged. Then came the moment that defined the rest of her war. Bismarck had taken 3 hits from Prince of Wales' 14-inch guns. One had penetrated the hull near the bow, rupturing fuel tanks and forcing her to trail a continuous oil slick. Admiral Lütjens, aware he could no longer sustain a prolonged Atlantic operation, decided at 1840 on May 24 to detach Prinz Eugen to continue commerce raiding independently while Bismarck turned to draw off the British pursuit. Bismarck opened fire briefly on her pursuers to cover the separation. Prinz Eugen slipped away to the south, undamaged and undetected. She made it to Brest on the coast of occupied France. Bismarck did not. Slowed by the fuel leak and ultimately crippled by a torpedo hit on her steering gear from a Swordfish aircraft launched by Ark Royal, she was overwhelmed on May 27 and sank. From that point forward, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht abandoned the surface raiding strategy and left the Battle of the Atlantic entirely to the U-boats. If you find yourself drawn to these accounts of ships that history placed in extraordinary circumstances, subscribing to the channel means you will not miss the ones still to come. Prinz Eugen spent the months after Brest as a fixture of British strategic anxiety. Together with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, she formed a squadron of capital ships sitting on the doorstep of the Atlantic, tied down by relentless RAF bombing raids, threatening convoys simply by existing. The Germans eventually concluded she was more of a liability on the French coast than an asset, and in February 1942 she took part in the so-called Channel Dash, the audacious daylight run through the English Channel back to German waters. She was torpedoed by a British submarine during that operation and required repairs, but she survived. She served in the Baltic subsequently, providing naval gunfire support during the retreat of German forces on the Eastern Front, and continued in active service until the war in Europe ended in May 1945. She had been at sea for the entire war and had never been sunk. Then came the second chapter of her improbable story. After Germany's surrender, Prinz Eugen was awarded to the United States Navy as a war prize. She was the only major German surface warship to survive the war largely intact, and American naval engineers and scientists were intensely interested in what she could tell them about German construction methods. She was sailed across the Atlantic, examined at Boston and Philadelphia, and then, in the summer of 1946, assigned a final role that no warship designer in the 1930s could conceivably have anticipated. She was to serve as a target ship in Operation Crossroads, the American nuclear weapons tests at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Operation Crossroads was the first public nuclear test series since Trinity in July 1945, and the first nuclear detonations of any kind since the bombing of Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Its stated purpose was to investigate the effect of nuclear weapons on warships. A fleet of 95 target vessels was assembled in Bikini Lagoon, including 4 obsolete American battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, Japanese warships including the battleship Nagato, and 3 Axis vessels of which Prinz Eugen was one. At the center of the target cluster, ships were positioned at a density of 20 vessels per square mile, 3 to 5 times greater than military doctrine would normally permit. The first test, designated Able, was conducted on July 1, 1946. The bomb, a Fat Man plutonium implosion device, the same type dropped on Nagasaki, with a yield of 23 kilotons, was dropped from the B-29 Superfortress Dave's Dream of the 509th Bombardment Group. It detonated 520 feet above the target fleet. It missed its designated aim point by 2,130 feet, and the resulting ship damage was less than expected. Prinz Eugen survived. The second test, designated Baker, was conducted on July 25, 1946. This time the device, known as Helen of Bikini, also 23 kilotons, was detonated 90 feet underwater. The underwater burst generated a column of radioactive water and produced extensive contamination across the entire target fleet. Chemist Glenn T. Seaborg, who would become the longest-serving chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, later called the Baker Test the world's first nuclear disaster. The radioactive sea spray soaked every ship in the lagoon. Most of the target vessels were so heavily contaminated that they could not be decontaminated and had to be scuttled. Of the 93 target ships, ultimately only 9 could be scrapped rather than sunk. Prinz Eugen was not among the 9. But she did not go down in the lagoon either. Structurally damaged and heavily contaminated, she was taken under tow after the tests. The contamination made it impossible for damage control parties to work aboard her for any sustained period. She developed a progressive list. On December 22, 1946, approximately 5 months after the Baker test, she capsized and sank in the shallow waters near Kwajalein Atoll. She lies there still, or rather, her wreck does, with her stern and twin propellers protruding above the waterline, a visible remnant at the surface of the Pacific. She had weathered the Denmark Strait, the loss of Bismarck, the RAF's sustained campaign against Brest, a torpedo in the Channel Dash, the entire 6 years of the Second World War, and then 2 nuclear detonations. She sank not under gunfire or torpedo, not under the hammer of a fleet action, but because of an invisible and pervasive contamination that no armor plate had ever been designed to resist. There is something in that which the designers at the Germania shipyard in Kiel would have found entirely beyond comprehension. The ship they laid down in 1936, the ship that stood in Bismarck's shadow at the Denmark Strait and emerged when Bismarck did not, she ultimately required the splitting of the atom to bring her low. And even then, she took 5 more months to go. The wreck of Prinz Eugen rests today as a war grave and a curiosity, visible above the waterline, visited occasionally by divers, still carrying tens of thousands of gallons of fuel oil in her tanks. She is remembered in naval history as the cruiser who outlasted everything the war could throw at her, and who made the Royal Navy's finest battlecruiser pay a steep price in those cold northern waters before she was done. Thank you for watching. If you would like to follow along as we tell more of these stories, subscribing and turning on notifications will ensure the next one finds you.